Thank you. You may be seated. It's interesting as you read through this psalm, a couple of things, and these are kind of sideline things. I don't know what you learned in school as far as English grammar is concerned. I talk about it. I talk about English grammar quite a bit, and you would think that was my favorite subject. And I absolutely hated English. I hated grammar. I hated literature because then you had to read. And all that sort of thing. I despised it. And yet, we're really going to understand what the Word of God is saying. We need to understand something to do with grammar. And so, one thing that you see throughout, he uses, like he does in verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, the word shall we don't use today. But the way we were taught in school, and again, I don't know how you were taught, but the way we were taught in school is shall is your normal use of the word. You only use the word will if you're emphatic about what you're saying. Like I said, we don't do that. We use will. We've totally shunned shall, to use another older word. But when you look what it says in verse 6, how it puts this together. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. So in other words, it's just a declaratory sentence. It's just a matter of fact. That's going to happen. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now you think about that for a little while, and that might actually get you excited. The fact that God's mercy and his goodness will follow us all the days of our life, that's just a matter of fact. It's just a matter of that's how it is, and that's how it's going to be. But we can be emphatic about the fact that we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And again, as we think about that, it's exciting. And there's a lot of things to be excited about in this psalm. But this is part 2 in our series that we started last week, Sheep of His Pasture. And we're talking today about the shepherd. I don't know if I've heard this, if I knew this, or what. But Psalm 23 to me has always been about the sheep. But as I was studying and as I was reading, it's not about the sheep at all. This psalm is about the shepherd. It's all about the shepherd. It's the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Verse 2, he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. Verse 3, he restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, and thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. You realize there's really only, 4 things here really that relate to the sheep. I shall not want is the first one. The second one, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Everything else in this psalm is about the shepherd. And again, a lot of times we look at it as it's talking about the sheep. No, it's not. It's not talking about the sheep. It's talking about the shepherd and the shepherd's care for the sheep, which is a totally different aspect. It's a totally different perspective. And so last week we talked about the sheep of his pasture. And we mentioned the fact that the sheep need a shepherd to whom to belong. Remember, we talked about that. I know I slept since then too, but we did. Trust me. We mentioned that last week. The thing is, the sheep cannot afford to remain in a lost condition. They can't afford to want, but they can find pasture and they can find water and they can survive. And in fact, we're going to talk here in a little bit. I've got an illustration I'm just holding back, sort of my trump card, as it were, that I'm going to throw down in a little bit. But it's about a sheep who went astray and was gone in hiding for 6 years. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in the long run, can a sheep really make it by itself? No, it can't protect itself. If there happens to be brown pasture in one area where the sheep is, it can't find its way to good pasture. It can't do that. And so they can't afford to remain in a lost condition, and they are susceptible to the dangers when they are lost and wandering from the shepherd. So now we're actually going to look at the shepherd, but we'll also see a little bit of the fact that the great shepherd also has given us under shepherds, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But when we get done, I believe that those of us who are the sheep of his pasture will, and we should, be overwhelmed by the infinite daily care of the shepherd that is far beyond just finding the lost sheep. See, that's usually where we stop. We stop with, well, he found us. There's so much more to the shepherd than just finding the sheep. Now, that's where we're going to start, because when we begin with the shepherd, we have to see him as the seeking shepherd, first of all. In Matthew chapter 18, verses 12 and 13, it says, "How think ye? If a man have 100 sheep, and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountains, and seeketh that which is gone astray? And if so be that he find it, verily I say to you, he rejoiceth more of that sheep than of the 99 which went not astray." So he's a seeking shepherd. He's not satisfied with sheep who are lost in sin and lost in sensuality, as we talked about last week. He's not, there's sheep out there, but whatever, let them do their own thing. That's their choice to be out there. Just, forget it. That, let them be. Let them do what they're going to do, and let them bear the consequences. That is not the heart, the attitude, or the action of the shepherd. He tells us in Ezekiel 34, verses 11 and 12, "For thus saith the Lord God, behold, I, even I, will both search my sheep and seek them out, as the shepherd seeketh out his flock in the day that he is among his sheep that are scattered. So will I seek out my sheep, and will deliver them out of all the places where they have been scattered in the cloudy and dark day." That's the kind of shepherd he is. He's not satisfied. Well, they're out there somewhere, but I don't know where. He doesn't consider that he has enough sheep in the fold, as we already read about the shepherd he's got 99 in the fold. But that's not good enough for him. He's still looking for that one, and I'm glad that he's still looking for that one. Because as I mentioned before, on January 18th, 1981, I was that one that he found. And I'm so thankful for that. His desire really is for every lost sheep to be found. Not just me, not just you, everyone. Well, there's a whole bunch of lost sheep that live in town with us. And it's the shepherd's idea, it's his heart, it's his desire for every one of those sheep to be found. In Matthew 18 and verse 14, it says, finishing up that parable about the shepherd going after the one, he says, "Even so, it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." It's not his will that one of even the little ones, the ones that don't matter, even the little ones, it's not his will for any of them to perish. And the shepherd has such a concern for his sheep and for the sheep that are lost that he's willing to lay down his life so that they might be found. In John 10 and verse 11, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep." Do you realize what he's saying there? The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. He does not say the good shepherd is willing to. The good shepherd does give his life for the sheep. And that's what Jesus did. He wasn't just willing to. And we know he was willing to. Otherwise, there's no reason that he should have left his glory in heaven and he should have been born in human form. There's no reason for that, except that he was willing to lay down his life, but then he followed through. Just like he said to Peter, as Peter's swinging his sword back and forth, and all he could get was the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus says to Peter, the cup that the Father giveth me, shall I not drink it? What he's saying is, not only am I willing to do it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to. And that's the kind of shepherd he is. He's concerned enough for us that not only does he, he knows the right thing to do, but he goes and follows through on what needs to be done in order for you and I to have been found. That's a wonderful thing and an amazing thing that he would do that for us. And in giving his life, what he did is he was betrayed by the very ones who should have been his friends. John chapter 1 and verse number 11 says about Jesus, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. The very ones who should have said, this is the one we've been looking for. Of course, that's what Philip said to Nathanael. That's what Andrew said to Peter. They said things along those lines, but those who knew the law, the high priest, the lawyers, and so on, they should have known who he was. They should have recognized what the Word of God was teaching and recognized that in him. But no, they wouldn't take him. Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 6, prophesying about Christ, says this, and one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. He was betrayed by those who should have loved him, who should have accepted him, by the very ones who should have been his friends. He was betrayed by them. And he knew that. He knew that going in, that was going to happen. And yet he was willing to give himself anyway because of the lost sheep. That was all part of finding the lost sheep. Because without Christ giving himself, we couldn't be found. We couldn't be saved today. And so that needed to happen, and thank God for it. And now the shepherd, while he is seeking us, he waits for us to return to him. The thing about, I know the illustration kind of breaks down here, doesn't it? The shepherd seeking the sheep, but then once he finds the sheep, he gives the sheep a choice. Do you want to come with me, or do you want to stay where you are? That's an amazing thing, because God's likening us to sheep. Now, I don't know if you spent any time around sheep. I've spent very little time with sheep, but I've spent enough time around them to know that they're dumb animals. And sometimes they're going to make decisions that are not for their good. And so they need, that's why you have a sheepdog. A sheepdog kind of changes their want to and gets them back in line following the shepherd and that sort of thing. But sometimes and so the sheepdog's there not to let the sheep have their own way, but to force the sheep, essentially, to make the sheep think that this is what I wanted to do all along. That's kind of what goes on. But that's not what God does with us. Now, God must look at us sometimes like we look at sheep and say, man, they're dumb. I've told them this is what I want. I've told them this is how it is. I've told them. And look what they're doing. Look at the decisions they're making. And God lets us do that. He lets us make those decisions. And so it's an interesting thing that while Jesus is a shepherd seeking the lost, yet he leaves the final decision as to whether that sheep comes back home. He leaves that decision to the sheep. Does that make him any less of a shepherd? No, absolutely not. That's what the Calvinist would say. Oh, you're saying that you're bigger than God. No, I'm saying that my God is so big that he'll allow me to make that decision. Even though he's God and he could make whatever decision he wanted to. But he allows me to make that decision. 1 Peter 2 and verse 25 tells us this. For ye were as sheep going astray, but are now returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. You see how that is? You were going astray. Now you've returned. You made that choice to come back to the shepherd. And we have that choice to make. Of course, we can reject the aid of the great shepherd, but that's not to our benefit. It's not to our benefit because there's no other way to be found. Again, the shepherd gave his life so that we might be found. There's no other way to be found except through what Christ did for us. And so he is the seeking shepherd. We also see that he is the supplying shepherd, and a lot of that is laid out for us here in Psalm 23. He supplies the necessities of the individual sheep. And the Lord's supply means that we will never do without. Again, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, the word want there has to do with lack. I shall not lack. Not all of my wants are fulfilled. Well, that's silly, because that just never happens, because we're human. And in our human condition, we always look at the grass as being greener on the other side. We always do. But as far as our wants, our needs, we're not going to do without, not as long as we're allowing the Lord to supply. And what we see is that the shepherd provides feed. In verse 2, he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. As sheep, we're really incapable of finding our own provision. We don't know how to take care of ourselves. We may make decisions and then follow down that road and realize this is not going where I thought I was headed. This is going somewhere else altogether. But when we allow the shepherd to supply, then that's what we need. And there's no spiritual drought when we stay by the shepherd. I don't know. I've heard a number of times over the years myself. I've heard it said about other pastors as well. Well, I just feel like I'm not getting fed here. You know, I feel like you're just, you're not feeding me. And the reality of it is, as long as we're with the shepherd, there's not going to be a spiritual drought. What happens is, in a situation like that, by and large, what's going on is the individual sheep won't eat. You understand what I'm saying? So the pastor studies the Word of God, and he finds the message that God has for him to preach. He studies, he prepares, he lays it out there like a buffet, and the sheep says, and then goes home and says, well, I just feel like I'm not getting fed down there at the church. Well, it's because you don't open your mouth and you won't put it in. I mean, not all of us, like Brussels sprouts and gross things like that. But, sometimes that's what you have to eat. Sort of like, I don't do it now, but, when I was growing up, every once in a while, Dad and Mom would have Brussels sprouts because my dad liked them. And because Dad liked them, my mom would make my sister and I eat some. And we didn't have to eat very many. They were pitying on us to some degree, I guess. And, they were horrible. It's just like, bitter little cabbages. I hate sauerkraut. I just do. And was it up to me, I wouldn't eat them. But you know what? Brussels sprouts and other vegetables that I don't like, they are good for you. And so it's the same thing. The Lord provides a lot of times the provision we need, but we turn up our nose and say, well, I don't like that. And then we turn around and say, well, I'm not getting fed there. Well, it's not that you're not getting fed, it's that you're refusing to eat what's there. Even though it's good for you, even though it's what you need, but the Lord's going to make sure that you have what you need, that it is there. It's funny that this psalm tells us that our provision will come in odd places. Look at how verse 5 begins. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Now, is that the place? Look, if the sheep recognize that the wolves are around, they're not going to be chomping at the grass and just enjoying life. They're going to be freaking out. They're going to be running back and forth, trying to figure out how to get away from the wolves that are circling the flock. And yet, the shepherd chooses that time to lay out a spread. Here, come eat. Well, it doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem logical. It doesn't seem reasonable. How in the world can we eat at a time like this? What happens when we get into a situation where we're upset by our circumstances? What do? Physically speaking, what do? We stop eating. Do you see a correlation here? Because we're looking around at the circumstance. I don't know how this is going to work out. I mean, this might be the end for me. I don't know what's going to happen here. And we're all upset. We're all bent out of shape. And, somebody says, you want something to eat? No, I'm not hungry. Whatever. We need to remember the Lord's taking care of it. So the Lord's going to provide what we need. Even at those times that we're upset and we're concerned about our circumstances, the Lord's going to provide. But the thing is, why worry about the wolves when we're in the presence of the shepherd? And we're going to talk more about that in a minute, so I don't want to jump ahead too far. So he provides the feed, but he also provides health. The rest here of verse 5 again, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. It's interesting as you study a little bit about sheep and what it means to anoint my head with oil. What is it? Why? What difference does it make? Thou anointest my head with oil. So what? I'm a king sheep now? No, that's not what it means at all. That's not what it's talking about. But I'm going to give you a couple of things that happen to sheep or can happen to sheep if their head is not anointed with oil. Or, of course, we have our modern synthetic versions of these things today. But there's fly time. There's the time of year where sheep are especially troubled by the nose fly or the nasal fly. And they will buzz around the sheep's head trying to deposit their eggs in the damp mucous membranes of the sheep's nose. If they're successful in that, the eggs will hatch in a few days to form small worm-like larvae. Those larvae work their way up the nasal passages into the sheep's head. They burrow into the flesh, and there set up an intense irritation accompanied by severe inflammation. That doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound like anything that I would want. What the sheep do in response to that, they'll deliberately beat their head against a tree, a rock, post, whatever's around. And they'll rub them in the soil, they'll thrash around against woody growth. And in some extreme cases, a sheep can even kill itself. Just trying to relieve the inflammation and just the hurt that's going on. Also in advanced stages of this infection that sets in, the sheep can become blind. And of course, that's not a good thing. Then they're really going to freak out because they can't see what's going on. And so there's all sorts of things that we could talk about. But when their head is anointed with oil, there's an immediate change in their behavior. Because what that oil does is that essentially the flies are repelled by that. And so they don't bother the sheep anymore. And so once that oil is applied, the sheep then start to feed quietly again. And they lie down in peaceful contentment. Thou anointest my head with oil. And isn't it amazing that these things, yes, it's flies that buzz around, but isn't it amazing that where it ends up attacking is the brain? There are things all the time that the devil is trying to bother us with and pester us with. And Where Satan attacks us is the mind. And we'll run around beating our head against the wall, just trying to get that frustration that the devil's trying to insert into our minds. We're trying to get rid of that. So we end up doing hurtful things that are hurtful to ourselves, just to relieve that, when all we have to do is wait for the Lord to take care of us. And that can be relieved. Then there's also scab time. Scab is a irritating, highly contagious disease that's common among sheep all over the world. And it's caused by a microscopic parasite that proliferates in warm weather. It spreads throughout a flock by direct contact between infected and non-infected animals. Sheep, they love to rub heads together, and scab is often found around the head, where they rub on each other and so on. And so it's easy for that to be spread. And guess what the cure or the prevention for that is? Back in Palestine, they used to take olive oil and some other things mixed together, and they'd pour it on the head of the sheep. And it would take care of that. Thou anointest mine head with oil. There's another thing too at mating time, because at mating time you have the rams, and who's going to be the big ram on the block, especially during that time of year that they're all excited, and so day and night the rams will be butting heads, and they can hurt each other, and they can even kill each other if they get too aggressive. And so what a lot of shepherds will do is they will take oil, or even they'll take just some grease even, and they'll put it on the horns and down the head, down the face of the sheep, so that when they go to butt heads, they don't really make good impact. They just sort of slide off and kind of go every which way, and then they're sort of like, what just happened here? And what it does, they kind of relieve some of the tension because they butted heads, but then because they, it seems so stupid, and they, okay, fine, I'll go my way and do whatever. That's what the Lord does with us. Sometimes, don't people butt heads? It happens all the time, more times than not, sadly. And what is it that can keep us from butting heads to the point where we hurt each other? Well, there's nothing in this life, because on the one hand, it's like, well, if they're part of some minority group that we've come up with, then you can't say anything to them. Well, then when you're not part of that minority group, that just makes you mad, because, hey, what about me? Don't I count? Nope, you don't count. It's just how it is. But then, anyway, our world has so many different ideas and so many different things. But then they tell us, well, you better stand up for your rights. So wait a minute, if I stand up for my rights, then I'm doing something against, and it's just crazy. But our world constantly wants us butting heads. The devil wants us constantly butting heads. I'm talking about the sheep of his pasture. Because if the devil can get us fighting each other, do you know what we're not doing? We're not reaching out to any other lost sheep. If the devil can get us to butt heads and hurt each other, that's even better. And if he can get us to kill one another, that's even better. From his standpoint, certainly not from a biblical standpoint. And so, as we stay close to the shepherd, he anoints our head with oil. So, yes, we're human. And sometimes we respond like humans do, and we butt heads. But it's such a stupid response that we stand back and say, well, that was dumb. I think I'll go over here and just forget about all this. But you know what? It's because the shepherd anoints our head with oil. See, he protects us. He provides for us as far as feed, but he also provides us with health in that way. Not only that, but there's also the idea of shearing time. A lot of times a shepherd, a pastor, is accused of trying to fleece the flock. Have you ever heard that? I've heard that a lot of different times as well. But a lot of times that's really not what's going on. Now, I'm not going to say there's no individual ever with the title of pastor who was not trying to fleece the flock. Because yes, there are false teachers, there are false prophets, there are. We will talk about that in just a second. But you know what? Sometimes what's going on is the under shepherd, as we'll call him, under the direction of the great shepherd, he's not trying to fleece the flock, he's trying to shear the sheep. And the sheep don't recognize the difference sometimes because they're not where they need to be spiritually speaking. And so they don't recognize the difference between fleecing the flock and shearing the sheep. Now, wait a minute, that's my wool. I grew that. What do you mean? You're going to shear me and take my wool away from me? Well, isn't that why God created sheep the way he did? God did not create sheep to keep their wool forever. That'd be one ugly sheep if it kept this wool forever. Now, listen, this is what I've been waiting to get to. There's Shrek the sheep. No, he wasn't green. Didn't have funny looking ears. He wasn't an ogre. He's Shrek the sheep. Some of you will get that. Some of you won't. That's fine. But Shrek the sheep became famous several years ago when he was found after hiding out in caves for 6 years. 6 years he's running. Now, like I said, he found feed somewhere. He found water somewhere. So he survived. But was he really better off away from the sheep? Now listen. When he was found, and then they finally sheared him, his fleece weighed 27 kilos. Think about that. That's a lot of fuzz to walk around with. 27 kilos. Most sheep, obviously, they're sheared every year. Most sheep have about 4.5 kilos, or at the most, 6.8. So anywhere from 4.5 or 4.5 to 6.8. He had 27. Is that healthy? So was he better off without the shepherd? For his own health, he needed to be sheared. He carried 6 times the regular weight of fleece simply because he ran away from the shepherd. See, that should tell us something. While maybe we can survive in a worldly sense, are we going to excel without the shepherd? No. No, we're not. Also, we see that the shepherd provides protection, correction, and direction here in verses 3 and 4. Here it says, he restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And the shepherd's direction can and will lead us through desolate places. Psalm 78:52 says, but made his own people to go forth like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. For 40 years, Israel wandered the wilderness. Literally, they wandered in the wilderness. Well, certainly, God can lead us through desolate places. Maybe not a desert, maybe not a physical wilderness, but maybe an emotional wilderness, maybe a mental wilderness, where we have to rely on the shepherd for our provision. We have to rely on the shepherd for our direction. We have to rely on the Lord for our protection. We have to rely on him for everything. The shepherd's direction can lead us through dangerous places, not just desolate, but dangerous places. Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 10, verse 16, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." But the thing is, in the midst of those desolate and dangerous places, we're not sent out by ourselves. We are there following the shepherd. And as long as we're following the shepherd, even though that may be a desolate place, even though it may be a dangerous place, it's not going to be dangerous to us because we're with the shepherd. In Hebrews, just such things as ye have, for he saith, "I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." So it doesn't matter where he leads us. He's not going to lead us out there and then in the middle of the night sneak off and we wake up in the morning, well, what happened to the shepherd? Where do we go from here? He's not going to do that to us. He's going to make sure that we're taken care of. Not only does he supply the needs of the individual sheep, but he also supplies the needs for the flock. Now, we're going to talk about the flock next week, so I don't want to get way ahead in this. But one thing that we find is that some of the needs of the individual sheep is provided through the flock. Well, I need Christian fellowship. Well, God's going to provide that through a church. Well, I need a place to, bounce some ideas off of people, so I can, because the Bible does tell us in the multitude of counselors there is safety. So I need a place where I can do that. God's provided that in a church. So there are many, many times in many ways that God provides for the individual through the flock, through the church that he's given us. In 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 and 4, it's talking about comfort and how we can find comfort. Here's what it says: "Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation." Okay, fine. So God comforts us, but it doesn't end there. "That we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted." What does that mean? That means that there's somebody that God wants to use us to comfort. But that's only going to be found in the flock. Shrek the sheep out wandering in the caves and all that. He didn't have any of that because he's out there by himself. He's not with the flock. He didn't have that. The shepherd, again, and we mentioned this before, but he supplied under shepherds to provide for the flock. Under shepherds, by which I'm talking about pastors. In Jeremiah 3:15, "And I will give you pastors according to my heart, which will feed you with knowledge and understanding." In Acts 20:28, "Take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock, over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood." The word pastor, by the way, it simply means shepherd. That's what it means. And so when he's talking about, "I'm going to give you pastors," I'm going to give you shepherds. Why? To do the work that he wants done, to supply what he wants supplied to the flock. And that's what they're there for. But the problem is, and we mentioned this already, the problem is there are some fake under shepherds, false teachers, false prophets. The problem is some of these are hard to find. They're hard to see. Again, we talked about wolves in sheep's clothing. For the sheep, it looks like a sheep. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Sometimes you don't know until afterward, that was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Sort of like the church that I was saved in. After my dad was pastoring the church, and after my dad left, another gentleman came in and pastored the church. And at first it seemed like, man, this is great. It seemed like the church was growing. There were people being saved, and it seemed like, man, this is wonderful. And then things started changing. We started noticing some differences because for a while we were still members of the church. So we knew some things that were going on. And so there were some things that just didn't look right. I mean, it's not really something you could put your finger on and say, this is wrong. But there was just an atmosphere that just wasn't right. And then little thing would pop up over here, kind of a little bit of suspicion. And this gentleman, he wouldn't allow any sort of suspicion. He would stomp somebody through the ground. And so he did, and he bragged about it. He bragged about it to me personally. Oh, look what I did. They stood up and you know what? The things that they accused him of, there were 2 or 3 of them that accused him of mishandling church funds. In the end, they were right. But he stomped them through the ground and made them lower than a snake's belly. And so nobody else in the church would say, well, let's look into this. Let's have, a CPA come in and audit the books. Nope, didn't do that. You know what happened? I don't want to get into all the details, but I'll just say this. He ended up going to prison. He was still pastor of that church when he was sentenced to prison. All the church people, they had begun to follow him instead of following his example of following the Lord. You understand the difference? They were following him. They couldn't see past him to see the Lord. He definitely wasn't lined up with the Lord with all the things he was doing. And after he went to prison, then everything came out. He was guilty of immorality. He was guilty of embezzlement. He was guilty of so many horrible, horrible things. He was a fake under shepherd. And it took a long time for people to figure that out. It took a long time. And what happens with these fake under shepherds? They wreak havoc among the sheep. Now, I'll tell you, that's the church I was saved in. I was 2 years old when we moved there and Dad became pastor there. And so for the beginning of my life, it's the only church I knew. I was 11 when we left. And so a lot of what I knew and thought about church revolved around that. And the people there, they were friends. They were like family because, again, I grew up there with them. After the church found out about all these things that happened, it totally flew apart. Some people ran away and joined this church. Some people ran away and joined this church. And some people just said, there's not any need for this. I'm just going home. And so today there's some people that they might be back in church, but they went through a horrible divorce and remarriage as a result of what this man did. And there's some that they still today. There's some people that, again, they were kids when I was a kid, maybe a year or two older than me. If I were to talk to him today, the one boy I'm thinking about, and say, look, why don't you get back in church? He'd pull up that fake shepherd's name. That's why I'm not going back to church. A fake shepherd wreaks havoc in the church and among the sheep. Jeremiah 50 and verse 6, my people hath been lost. Their shepherds have caused them to go astray. They've turned them away on the mountains. They've gone from mountain to hill. They have forgotten their resting place. These fake under shepherds, their goals for the sheep are not goals for, hey, I want you to be as close to the Lord as you can be. That's not their goal. Their goal for you is, I want you to do the best for me that you can. It's all about what have you done for me lately? Philippians chapter 3, verse 17 through 19, brethren, be followers together of me. Now, Paul's saying, follow me. But is he saying, follow me no matter what I do? Actually, if you put it together with other things he says, follow me as I follow Christ. That's the thing. If you can look at Christ and see me right there in line with Christ, like you're looking down the sights of although some of you wouldn't understand that. But anyway, if you can see, you see Christ and there I am, then follow me. But if you see me, here's Christ, and you see me off over here, and that's not in line, don't follow me. You follow Christ. And that's what Paul's saying. And he goes on and mark them, which walk so as ye have us for an example. In other words, if there's others, well, you put them there. Okay, I see that here's some other people. They're following along too, so I'm going to follow their example. But he goes on in verse 18 and says, for many walk, whom I've told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ. But wait a minute, they're in church, but they're the enemies of the cross of Christ. And he goes on to describe them, who's in this destruction, whose God is their belly. In other words, they're in it for what they can get. So these fake under shepherds, they're all about, what you got for me? What can you do for me? Now, I think, and I believe, that a church should take care of their pastor. And I think that a church should do their very best for their pastor. I've known a lot of churches to do a lot of good things for their pastor. Now, I'm not asking for anything. Don't think that that's what I'm doing. I'm just laying out a principle here. These fake under shepherds, they didn't think, well, that's how it should be and whatever the church does. No, they'll bring it up. Oh, the church ought to be doing this for me. Well, the church ought to be providing that for me. Well, the church ought to be doing something else for me. Now, again, in our business meetings, who is it that brings up different things? It's the pastor. So if the pastor is going to bring up anything about salary or any kind of benefit, he's going to have to bring it up. Nobody else is going to bring it up. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying about that either. But I am saying that it's all about, what are you doing for me? Hey, I really would put my heart into the church, but the church just doesn't give me that much. I've heard people say this. And it's like, that's, it's telling me something I don't want to hear. Because it sounds like a fake under shepherd that's going to wreak havoc in the flock. And these fake under shepherds, they have no concern for the sheep. Because once they get everything they can out of the sheep, they'll move on. Sort of like the pastor who he led the church to go into a big building project. And the church went into debt that they could not afford. But it was interesting that as material was being delivered to the church site for the building of whatever they were building, the leftover material that was still on the truck after they unloaded the church's order went right around the corner to the pastor's house. And while they're doing this building, the pastor's remodeling his house, which the church thought belonged to the church. Now it gets worse. When he resigned as pastor of the church, rather than saying, well, this is the pastor's house, belongs to the church, he put the house up for sale. And he made a good bit of money on that house that he paid nothing for. The church had provided it for him to live in. And somehow he had finagled where he got his name on the deed of the property rather than the church. And so he sold it. And so the next pastor came in and there's nowhere to live. He had to try and go find his own place, which it's fine. That can be done, obviously. But when the church didn't have a lot of money because of all the debt, most of your money goes to rent. And there's nothing left for groceries, nothing left for gas or anything else. I'd like to say that that was the only time that pastor did that, but he did that to that same church twice because he pastored that church twice. And the first time they had a house, and when they left, he sold it. And then they got another house after he left, and when he came back, he lived in that house, and when he left, he sold that one again. So he did it twice. He wasn't concerned about those sheep. When he left, there was hardly anybody there. They were in debt up to their eyebrows. They couldn't hardly make the mortgage every month. It was wrong. It was really wrong. And it all had to do with a fake under-shepherd. He didn't care about them. He just wanted to build this real nice building where he could say, hey, look, I pastor this church. It's got this nice building. What's that all about? You know, how does that help if people in the church are hurting? How does that help if people in the church are confused about what's right and wrong about what the Bible teaches? That didn't help at all. It just made him look good as he traveled around to other churches. Hey, look at our building. Yeah, we've got this and we've got that. Anyway, here's what Jesus says in John 10, verse 12. But he that is an hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth. And the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth, because he is an hireling, and careth not for the sheep. So we have to be careful. We have to be wise about that. But the last thing we see about the shepherd, and I'm going to hit this very quickly, is that he is a securing shepherd. In Isaiah 40 and verse 11, it says, he shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs in his arm and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. That tells us he is, like I said, a securing shepherd. John 10 verse 2, but he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. He knows his sheep by name. That's an important thing. And he leads them out. He sets the example for them. But you see, that also tells us that the sheep of his pasture are protected by the shepherd. In John 10 verse 7, then said Jesus unto them again, verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. But you also see that the sheep of his pasture are eternally secure in the shepherd. In John 10, 27 and 28, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, and I give unto them eternal life. Neither shall they perish, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. Do you see all of this that we're saying is that we have a great shepherd. We may be the sheep of his pasture, and that's a wonderful thing to be. But the thing that makes it wonderful is not because of us. Oh, look at me, I'm a sheep of his pasture. That's not what makes it wonderful. What makes it so wonderful is because of who the shepherd is. Because he's a seeking shepherd, he sought us. He's a supplying shepherd. He provides for us, and he's a securing shepherd. He protects us now. Amen. And he protects us for all of eternity. What a great shepherd we have today. Let's stand together with our heads bowed and eyes closed.